Okay, hello. Um, Welcome to my channel. If you're returning or you're new, this is going to be a different video, as you can already tell. My older videos on my channel are my podcast of sorts, where I kind of ramble about whatever's on my mind in terms of creativity and writing and culture, blah, 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 blah. It's a lot of different topics. But today's video, as you can tell by the title, is a media analysis of Stranger Things. And this is for my Stranger Things class at San Diego State University, but also something that I've been wanting to do in the first place. So the two just kind of met perfectly. And if you're from my Stranger Things class, hi. This is my creative project, and we'll be talking about Stranger Things and race, specifically racism, race, um, what's missing from the series. And if you are not from my Stranger Things class, I was assigned to do a project where we discussed Stranger Things as a text in some manner creatively, and I like to be creative analytically, so I chose to do a media analysis on racism within Stranger Things. Race and racism, I should say. Um, so, we're going to go ahead and just jump straight into it. This video is going to be completely different for those of you familiar with my podcast because I have a bunch of notes that I'm going to be referring to. Mostly just kind of small textual notes for me to make reference to and keep me organized. So different from the podcast. So let's begin. For context, I think it's really important to start with Stranger Things is set in the early to mid 80s. I did just look that up just to verify. So this is kind of a really important time historically for America. You know, you have the civil rights movement that just happened in the 60s and is continuing to have a ripple effect throughout throughout the decades, especially in the 80s, where we start to see more bigger movements that I will get into. The key focus on this historically is that Reagan in 1980 is going to become president. We already know this happened, but within the show, he is advocating there is a shot where there is a Reagan presidential board that's like vote Reagan, you know, like this is who I'm voting for kind of thing. I have no idea why I just did the Nixon thing, so apologies. Not sure. Um, so in season one, we see that Reagan billboard. So season two would then roughly take place within the second year of his term, 81, or first year. I'm not sure about the semantics. American elections are weird because you get elected in November, but it doesn't start until January. Just doesn't make sense. I'm not a politics major, so I don't know. But I digress. So we have this kind of important historical moment, um, not the Reagan election, but more specifically the civil rights movement and what happens after that. And Reagan did not run on very positive racial movements or policies. I did some quick research, and it just looked like his policies were very like indirectly supposed to help minority people, but in fact, it ended up just hurting them more because what ended up happening is that judges were elected into government positions, or judges were elected as judges are, and then they promoted racist policies and laws that did not benefit people of color. And looking back, now that we're 40 years away from that time, we can tell how bad it was. But in that moment, things were starting to bubble up, but really hadn't taken place just yet. So that's a really important thing. Um, Later on, we're going to see in 1984, Jesse Jackson runs for president, and he is the first African American to do so on a full campaign, big blowout kind of thing. Many apologies, that's my clock, grandfather clock. Hopefully you can't hear it. So we're having a lot of like there's racism, but there's also pro black movements, black pride, and black culture. Essentially, I kind of just boil this down to like Black Lives Matter, like the basis of it. Like um, black people have always been advocating for their rights, but if we were to look from then to now, I would say that this kind of starts um, the origins of Black Lives Matter and pushing for black rights or African American rights as well as minority rights. So we have all of that happening. right away at the start, and I want to get into why this is important, why this is relevant. That was a hair that just fell from my hair. Um, I don't know. This is going to be unedited, so many apologies for the organic feeling. Um, I just think it's nice to kind of keep things organic. Um, Once again, I digress. So let's get into the character of Lucas Sinclair, who is the sole main person of color within the Stranger Things cast in season one, and we can make the argument for season two. There is another minority character who has speaking lines more than just the sheriff's deputy, who's unnamed. I think he has a name, but I don't catch it. He shows up. There's like two deputies to Chief Hopper, but they're only there because they're deputies. Like they don't have any importance to the plot. So Lucas Sinclair takes the main role as the minority character within the Stranger Things cast, within the Mike, Will, and Dustin friend group, as well as in season two when the group expands to um, allow in other people like Nancy, Jonathan, Steve, Maxine, or Max, and Joyce Byers. Yeah, I said Steve. Um, so Lucas is one of the only minority characters within a really racially charged time. And Stranger Things is attempting to be historically accurate. We can see that in references to major political events and commercials and cultural icons. Max in season two has like a Halloween mask. The Mike Myers. Sorry, I couldn't remember his name right off the top of my head. She has a Mike Myers mask and she runs out like holding a knife and she's like, "Ah," like it's a fun jump scare, but it's a reference to what's going on in the culture. So Stranger Things is trying to be adherent to what's happening in the world, but it's also ignoring some really major movements um, because a lot of the characters are white and they are not personally affected by the election of Reagan, by whatever's going on anywhere. I mean, they're kids, but like this is a really critical time, and I can't imagine that these kids aren't being taught to some degree what's happening in the world as well as what racism looks like because segregation just ended like 20 years ago. That's a 1 to 2 generation gap. If Lucas's parents or any of the other kids' parents didn't directly grow up in segregation and or the civil rights movement, their parents at least did. But I'm willing to bet that the parents, the parents of the kids, Mike, Will, Dustin, and Lucas, were all um, within experiencing segregation. I mean, they weren't, except for Lucas's parents, they weren't African Americans or minorities of any kind, but I can guarantee that historically they knew what was going on because their schools were segregated, their water fountains were segregated, their movie theaters were segregated. So there's a lot going on that's just not being mentioned. Lucas Sinclair is the sole representation of just representation, but when you look at all the shots, and if you're not paying close attention, he is the only minority character, the only person of color in those shots. You could kind of scan the crowds and maybe you'd find a couple people of color, but predominantly this is a white school, it's a white town. And yes, I know it's set in Hawkins, Indiana, but it's a fictional town and people of color exist anywhere. Like this is not an excuse to avoid characters of color just because you think they wouldn't live in fictional town USA. Like that's no excuse whatsoever. So we just have Lucas's family and the deputy who seem to be the very few people of color, specifically African Americans, who are living in Hawkins, Indiana. Um, and that plays no part anywhere. Lucas Sinclair is not acknowledging the racism that's going on in the world. He has one very simple arc from season 1 to 2, and that's from skeptic to believer. He is hard against everything that's going on in season one. He doesn't believe Eleven. He doesn't believe Will, and it has to happen to him for him to become a believer. And season two happens, and he switches really hard to becoming a believer, understandably. Um, and now he's trying to convince Max of what's happening and the truth of the matter, and she's now the non-believer. But she catches on way faster. But essentially, that's what Lucas's character arc is boiled down to: is just skeptic to believer. He doesn't have any growth. He doesn't have any emotional development. His lines could be said by anyone. His actions could be done by anyone. And that's the problem. Is there's this character within one of the most racially important times in America, and also within the time that Stranger Things came out, um, nowadays, as in I think like 2016, but all the way up to 2020 because it's still going on. These are really important times. The civil rights movement didn't just die out just because the 80s were over or the civil rights movement ended. They're still important. And so, for the fact that Lucas Sinclair doesn't acknowledge any of what's going on or doesn't have any kind of say in the matter or any kind of reflection on the matter, it it's telling that he wasn't written to be an important person of color character. He's just a throwaway. And I don't mean that as in Lucas Sinclair, like, the person who should be blamed is the writers, not the actor or the character themselves. Because it's not the character's fault, it's not the actor's fault, it's the writer's fault for ignoring crucial moments within American history. I would argue more important than just subtle references to culture, like the Ghostbusters, and there's a moment where even like Lucas is basically given the role of the only minority character in Ghostbusters. Um, and it's like he didn't want to play that character. He wanted to be someone else. He wanted to be an important character. So even Ghostbusters is not adhering to what's racially going on in the world. That's a completely different conversation and not at all what I had planned to talk about. But it is important to note that like the characters didn't even want to be the minority character in Ghostbusters. They wanted to be the cool heroes, the white saviors, you know? Are I'm trying not to be passionate or excited or like really like in your face about this, but like I hope my point is being driven that this person of color character could easily have been replaced by anyone else and it would change nothing. Lucas Sinclair is not written to be cognizant of what's going on racially in America. And I keep saying this over and over again, and I will continue to say it until the video is over. This is one of the most important times in American history in terms of, man, let me just, there we go. Sorry, telephone. Everything happens when you're trying to record. But as I was saying, it's one of the most important times in American history, and he's just apathetic. There is no reference. The parents, Lucas's parents, just talk about family relationships, and while Stranger Things as a gothic text talks about sexuality and family relationships and um, uh, substitutes for those familial relationships, let me just close that. That was bothering me. And substitutes for family relationships, racism should not be ignored just because your topic is on something else. It's irresponsible because you're a modern day writer and you can't put in a representation character without having them actually act as a character of that minority group or that of that ethnicity or race or anything would. You can't just put in some random character and be like, well, um, this is the Hispanic friend, and he or she or they have no connection to their Hispanic culture or Hispanic events in Hispanic history. They are just Hispanic character A. Like, it's really irresponsible. And it gets worse because there's another character who is a person of color. There are several other characters that are people of color within season two that, once again, no racial references, no references to anything of importance that's going on within the timeline of Stranger Things. So let me elaborate. We move into season 2, and we are introduced to Kali, or number 8, however you would like to refer to her, and she is ambiguously a person of color. She is a brown woman, and kind of vaguely, maybe Indian, because she is referred to as a Hindu god of destruction. So right away, she's immediately tied to her race, like, and possibly her religion if she were a practicing Hindu, right away. But as we go through that moment, because she's only really in like a couple, she's in like season episode 1 and then episode 7. And episode 7 is where she is fully formed as a person, but there are no references to her race or her identity. All we know is that she was around 11 in the Rainbow Room at the same time. She's definitely older. She looks older, and I think she was definitely way older even in that moment, maybe by a couple years. We don't know how old 11 is, so I would wager Carly is maybe like 5 to 10 years older. I don't know. And thirdly, I she's only referenced as being from London. It just has like a newspaper clipping, and it just says like "girl missing in London." So it's like, okay, well, she's from England, and she's a person of color. That's all we really know about her. And then as it develops, we learn that she is with a ragtag group of 3 other people of color and 2 white people. And it's like, okay, you have Kali, you have the guy who's referred to as a teddy bear. I can't exactly remember his name. And then there's another character who is the black character, or they're both black. Um, the other black character who, once again, no race mentioned, no racial comments in terms of like her identity. It's just like, this is a character. Please look at her. And they're in a ragtag group of misfits who go around terrorizing the people that wronged them. And the morality of that is fine. Of course, you'd want revenge. But if you were to look at it in a different perspective, one could argue that they're being portrayed as racial stereotypes, that they're violent, that they're aggressive. And while the character who I'm going to refer to as the teddy bear or Teddy, he's a big muscular dude, but then he has like, a soft inside. Oh, he's so sweet. And he has like a teddy bear mask when he goes into the house of one of the assistants of Dr. Brenner. Um, he is still that big aggressive black guy. Like, even if you were to look at it differently, it's like some people would be like, well, that's just the racial stereotype that all black people are like, or all minorities are like, they're, aggressive, ragtag, and they're only out to do crimes and they don't want to contribute to society. And it's so just like Stranger Things is not engaging with these conversations, and so therefore they're just allowing people to make their own assumptions about the characters. They're not taking responsibility for the minorities within their text. They're saying, you know what? This has nothing to do with our white characters. We're going to put them in there for the sake of representation, but we're not going to do anything with them. Cully gets two, one real episode, and like an opening scene in episode 1, and she's done for now. She may come back, she may not. She's left open-ended, but I highly doubt she's going to make a comeback because I don't see the Stranger Things writers being responsible with their characters or their people of color, or characters of color. Um, and then, it's taking place in Chicago, which is already a place that's experiencing a lot of racial movements, like um, big movements towards civil rights and Black Lives Matter. I even wrote down some notes that government officials in Chicago were being elected, or let me start over. African Americans were being elected as government officials in Chicago and around the country. But I did specific research on Chicago in the 1980s for reference, um, to see what the climate was like in Chicago at the time that 11 would be showing up. And we can get into the semantics of, oh, well, it hadn't happened yet. It's only 1981 in season 2, roughly. But it's like, you won't make reference to the people who are running for president or are making bids for president or are making bids for government positions. You're not going to make reference to any of that. We're just going to leave it as it is. So ultimately, Lucas and Kali are victims of the Stranger Things writers' apathy towards their characters of color. And a really important thing to note that I wrote down is that they are, in fact, just assistants to the white savior, the character who is going to save them. Lucas is significantly attached because they're friends, of course, to Lucas. Sorry, excuse me. Lucas is significantly attached to Mike, Will, and Dustin, and primarily Will and Mike are the two key figures here in terms of the white saviors because they are the enactors of the plot. And while Dustin has his time to shine in season two and subsequently season three, he is not so much a key moving piece. It is Mike and Will who are the key moving pieces within season one and season two. And then you have Kali, whose white savior is actually 11, who shows up out of nowhere, and they're like, oh, we're sisters, essentially, because we grew up in the same area and went through similar experiences, so they're family. And then 11 essentially pacifies Kali to a degree. The ending of Kali in I keep wanting to say season 7, in season 2, episode 7, is that 11 runs away after not killing the assistant of Dr. Brenner. And Kali's upset with that. Like, why didn't you do it? They don't deserve mercy. They don't deserve this. Why would you do that? And then she runs away as Kali and the crew make their escape. And Kali is left with this last shot where she's like looking into like a rainy window, and it transitions to 11, who is also looking at a rainy window, thinking of home. We don't really know what's going on in the interiority of Kali's mind, but it's hard to argue against the fact that she's probably thinking about mercy and family and what that means to her. So essentially, Kali is somewhat pacified. She is distant from her group as they are making their escape, and I believe they're even trying to talk to her, and she is just non-responsive because she's so lost in thought. So it kind of puts off this aura that Kali is being pacified by Eleven and is therefore saved by her, and Eleven, as we see throughout the seasons, is the savior. So this white savior comes in for an episode and experiences the world that this angry, aggressive group of um, misfits, and then she leaves and they seemingly be pacified, or at least Kali is. So there's a lot that I'm trying to say, but at the end of all of it, Stranger Things is being irresponsible with their minority characters, their people of color. They are taking bold stances on sexuality and identity in terms of the Gothic text, which is a completely different conversation that is really fleshed out, and it would take, I mean, I'm taking a literal class on it. So that goes to show how much there is, um, for those of you who aren't in my class. Um, it's an hour every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so that's a lot of conversation to be had. It's filling out a lot of space, which is great. It just goes to show that that conversation is amplified by the writing of Stranger Things. But in terms of race and racism, it's seemingly non-existent. I have not yet mentioned one key part that kind of ties Stranger Things into the kind of aura or the response to civil rights movements, specifically for minorities. Um, and that is Billy's response to Lucas. Now, for context, in season two, Billy is trying to, excuse me, Billy is trying, gosh, I was already on the wrong train of thought. Lucas is trying to convince Max not only to join their group, but also that the events of season one were true and are happening, and they are continuing to happen in season two. So he is trying to make her go from skeptic to believer. And alongside that, Max is trying to hide the fact that she has friends or that she's kind of buddy with those people, as Billy so lovingly, I say sarcastically, puts it. Um, And so the comment essentially that Billy makes is that Lucas and Max are just about to leave the arcade, and Max is getting into the car or whatever, and Billy is like, "I don't want you associating yourself with those people." And the only one that he could be possibly referencing is Lucas, because Lucas is the only one of that group that is there. He's not referring to the arcade because Max has gone multiple times, and we're just going to go off the assumption that Billy has not made any comment like that. Like Max just goes in, plays Dig Dug, and leaves. So one could be like, oh, well, he just means in general, like he thinks that X, Y, and Z are trouble, or he doesn't want Max to be friends, to have friends for whatever reason. There's no justification for that comment. Or Billy is an enactor of the racism that is still ongoing within the world of Stranger Things season two, and he's the only one to really make such a a racially I don't want to say racially conscious, but he's very conscious of the racism that's impacted in a sentence like that, like those people. So the Stranger Things writers have decided like we're gonna have this moment where Lucas is gonna be the victim of verbal racism, but then after that we're not gonna do anything with it. It's just really irresponsible. I just want to double check my notes. Yeah, it's just really irresponsible of them to not even divulge, or what's the correct word, to even go into the conversation of racism when it's such a racially charged moment, and it's coming on the wings. And when it was written and then published or showcased on or released on Netflix, still a really important time for civil rights and anti-racism. So it's just like they're like, we're going to make this show that's nostalgic about the 80s, but we're going to ignore all the negatives of the 80s. We're going to have arcades and Dungeons and Dragons and pop culture, but oh, here's Reagan. And then they're not going to talk about racism. Like, you were being so irresponsible with your time and your writing, and it, it's not a good look. So yeah, that is essentially my media analysis of Stranger Things within the realm of race and racism, especially in a critical time such as the 1980s, and then also a critical time that we have now, where Black Lives Matter is really taking root and fruition. I mean, obviously it started a little while ago, before 2020, but again, we're having peaceful protests and more hashtags and everything that are um, against racism. So you would think that writers who are writing consciously and well would be conscious of the racism that was prominent within the 1980s as well as nowadays, but they just weren't. And it is really irresponsible. So that's my big beef about it. Um, this is a media analysis, so analysis I try to keep neutral, but this is not something I'm going to remain neutral on. And there are many things I won't remain neutral on. Um, it's a big deal. If you're going to write characters that are going to be diverse, then you have to have them experience life in a diverse way. You can't just write characters who are essentially minorities or people of color who just act like white people. And I don't mean like act like white people like Lucas is acting like a white person. I mean like if you were to take Lucas Sinclair and take him outside of the race that he if you were to take him outside of being black and just make him white, it would change nothing. Would change literally nothing. He doesn't have any lines, he doesn't have any interactions, he doesn't have any experiences or thoughts or beliefs about being black in America. He is just the assistant to the white savior. That is really grossly irresponsible. I don't know how else to drive that home any further. And I didn't even dive into the depths of like Chicago and the 1980s and nowadays. Like Chicago is not a small town in terms of what's going on in terms of the civil rights movements. Chicago and other big cities are kind of really pushing the movements of Black Lives Matter and civil rights. So to have Chicago be this quiet town where you just have some homeless people or gangs, quote unquote, they're not referred to as gangs. They're not any way associated with gangs. It's just kind of what the presentation of Chicago is is you have the nice quiet domesticity of the person that Kali and Eleven visit, a nice suburban home in Chicago, and then you have Eleven's first experience with Chicago, and it's rough, it's gritty, there's homeless people, they're crazy, it's just grossly irresponsible. And there's so much more to unpack in that. And in terms of season three, I haven't seen it in a while, so I can't make any critical comments, but I can say for certain that it's still going to be irresponsible because once you've set a standard for irresponsible, where you've set a standard for being irresponsible, it's not going to be that easy to shake, and they're probably not going to want to shake it because the Duffer Brothers are not representing their characters appropriately. Even the female characters are just cardboard stereotypes. I mean, they're not cardboard in the fact that they're two-dimensional. They're cardboard in the fact that they come as certain types of stereotypes. Joyce Byers is the hysterical woman. Nancy Wheeler is the prom queen turned hero turned I don't know, the badass, like we can do it kind of thing, which is great. Don't get me wrong, but she doesn't have the depth to kind of engage with those kind of conversations. She is just a cardboard of that. And then you have Mrs. Wheeler, who is the um, neglected housewife who just wants like passionate love affair and is neglected by her man. It just goes to show that Stranger Things is not very responsible with its important conversations. Instead, it's opted to be about science fiction and um, inadvertently gothic literature and nostalgia. And it's like we had a lot of conversations about Stranger Things and nostalgia and how that works, but we're not having enough conversations about how Stranger Things is not dealing with. That was a double negative. Let me start over. We're not talking about how Stranger Things is being irresponsible with its minorities, its people of color, its conversations that are harder to talk about. Stranger Things is very fluffy and you don't have to worry about racism because it's escapism, but it's like it it's not. Like if you're gonna literally reference the election of Ronald Reagan and you're not gonna talk about racism, or like you briefly mention what's going on in the Middle East, but you won't mention the civil rights movement to any capacity, even though one of your main characters is black, there's a major problem there. There's a major problem there. So it's really irresponsible and it's really frustrating. And I just think all writers should be more self-aware. We should be writing more diverse stories, and we should be more aware and responsible with those diverse stories. White people shouldn't be afraid to write about black people. I mean, obviously, like, you can only do so within certain parameters because you are not a black person and therefore do not have all the shared experiences, but you shouldn't be afraid to include black people into your text. You shouldn't be afraid to include people that are not the same race or ethnicity or sexuality or gender, religion, etc., 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 into your text. It's an important part of the conversation. And so if you fail to do so, you're a passive bystander to the racism and the discrimination that's going against those people you claim to represent. So, my final concluding thought is that Stranger Things, as a literary text on or literary text within the parameters of having a diverse cast, is grossly irresponsible. There are two major characters who are people of color. Then in season three, you get Lucas's sister, but she's not really a main character. She's still a side character because she doesn't play that much of a role until towards the end as a kind of mechanic of the plot. Um, that's not a spoiler. It's just what happens. I don't. That's just like as clinical as I can get with it. Is she is not the Deus Ex Machina, but she is a sort of device that moves the plot along. Once again, grossly irresponsible with her diverse characters. Lucas's sister doesn't really discuss racism in America. And while I know the counter argument to all of this is that they're kids, but it's a fictional story. And these kids are experiencing things that kids shouldn't be experiencing in the first place. They're literally experiencing alternate dimension space invaders that trying to destroy the world, and they're the only ones that are like willing and able to like combat that. And so when you neglect to talk about racism, it just shows just gross irresponsibility. Because you can't make the argument that like, oh well, they're just kids. It's like, well, they're literally fighting like a world-ending monster, and you expect me to just be like, oh well, they're just kids, you know? Let's not talk about racism. They're just kids. What do they really know? It's like I know that these kids know about racism. Because Lucas is only one of the very few people, if you were to look at a specific shot when they're in class, one of the very few people of color. And if you looked closely, maybe. But what's more important is the initial shot, the initial consumption of the scene, is that there is only one person of color in that shot, and it is Lucas Sinclair, juxtaposed against all these other white kids. So it's just irresponsible. And I cannot defend something that is irresponsible with its diverse cast, or doesn't even have a diverse cast in the first place. I'm being generous by saying diverse cast. There are like Lucas, parents, Lucas's sister, Collie, Teddy Bear, the other girl whose name I don't really remember, um, within Collie's group, and the one of Jim Hopper's sheriffs. It's 8 characters of color, um, most of them being black, one of them being Indian. So that doesn't even go to start with Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans. It's exhausting, and I could just keep going and going and going because, like I said, it's unscripted and I'm trying to make it as organic as possible. But I want to just reiterate how grossly irresponsible it is. Yeah, that's pretty much everything I really wanted to mention. You have a really important time in American history happening then in the text, and now as the time surrounding when the text was released. And as literary critics, that's important to reference is what time is it set in, but also what time is it being written in, what time was it published in. It's just being grossly irresponsible with those two facts. And nostalgia and science fiction don't cover up how you need to have diverse characters instead of just subjecting them to the white savior and subjecting them to paper thin plot lines. So, once again, thanks for visiting my channel. This has been my media analysis of Stranger Things and race and racism. I'm going to try and do more stuff like this with a lot more research involved. Um, but since it's just for my creative project, I didn't want to get bogged down in a lot of specifics. I wanted to present it as my own thoughts and opinions more so, and to show my engagement with the text, with the series. So if you are a old subscriber of my channel and you're watching this, thanks for watching. I know it's different. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you're from my Stranger Things class, I also hope you enjoyed it. Um, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time to stick around for a 38-minute plus video that will be unedited. I know that that is time dedication, and I appreciate that. So yeah, um, I'm signing off now. This is weird not doing it in my podcast sign off, and so I'm having a hard time ending it, but I'm just going to say have a lovely day, afternoon, or evening, and yeah, thank you.